instead of talking about the politician, what they will do is they will brand a politician with one of these figures from the Old Testament that's usually a villain. In Branham's day, he labeled JFK as Ahab, and he labeled Jacqueline Kennedy as Jezebel. And so all of the listeners who were programmed with that is loaded language to refer to those people as those two. Well, then every sermon thereafter where he's talking about them, he would say things like, we need somebody today who will stand up and rise up against Ahab, or we need to storm Ahab's door. Well, if you're listening to it and you don't understand this loaded language, you don't realize that those are very militant terms to people who might just be crazy enough to go do it.
The critical component to mind control.
Being made over to be clones of the person who's at the top of the pyramid.
Interested in the subject because of my own cult involvement. I was recruited in 1974 into a front group of the Moonies.
Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of my podcast, Cult Conversations, the Influence Continuum, with me, Dr. Steve Hassan. I have an old friend and colleague with me today, John Andrew Collins. I'm adding the Andrew since John Collins is a name owned by many people, and my esteemed guest has written many important books, and I want you to, aside from going to the blog and clicking the links, I want you to be able to identify him quickly. John is a former third-generation William Branham message cult member. His family was actually royalty in the William Branham message cult. And I believe, John, it was your grandfather was Willard Collins, and he was the pastor at the Branham Tabernacle in Jeffersonville, Indiana. And so you were steeped in this ideology that people don't know who William Branham is. They don't understand how it's like the beginning of a bad tree with lots of roots and lots of branches that have morphed into the new Apostolic Reformation and so many other destructive authoritarian groups. But you have deconstructed the whole darn thing. You went to the library, you incredible amount of research that you've done, just deconstructing for yourself, but with an eye to help everybody else. And I think there's some like 2 million people who are still caught up in the Branham message cult worldwide. So it's a real thing. And we recently reconnected over the assassin, Vance Belter, who murdered the Hortmans in Minnesota. So we talked about his getting recruited into a Branham cult, and then I interviewed his former floor mate who went to play baseball practice with him. So there's a whole side story to this, but we've done a bunch of interviews previously, but I want you to explain the William Branham Historical Research Society, your amazing website, and tell us your backstory, and then we'll get into the stuff of today.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Steve. It's good to reconnect. We've done so many things together in the past, but it is good to be here on your new platform to talk through this. Whenever we first met, I honestly did not know that I would be doing what I'm doing today, even though I had done some research. I had published a book, a few books, but had no idea that I would be doing what it is that I'm doing today. William Branham is this forgotten name that nobody remembers, and yet he caused such chaos in, as we'll get into with the Bolter issue, many different varieties of cults and splinter groups and extremism. The doctrines that he laid down, which were not his own, but he claimed them as divine revelation, is just woven through time into many, many different groups. It was, if you're a Marvel fan, which I am, it's like
Me too.
It's like the Spider-Verse. It's where it all comes together in this web and it all connects. And
yeah,
when I began my journey, I had no idea. All that I knew was that I was in a church that, for some reason, it just suddenly wasn't making sense to me. It had up until that point, I would have actually died for the religion. I would have died for my faith. And something happened. I went through a series of very, very tragic events that really shook me. And I just kind of snapped out of it. And I began to wonder, well, why am I in this thing? Why do I believe that this man was the divine voice of our age before the lost and dying world? And why do I believe that this doomsday is imminent? And that question literally spawned off all of my research. And as you said, my grandfather was the head pastor of the Branham Tabernacle, which nobody in today's world is familiar with. But if you trace it through the Spider-Verse, you'll find people like Joel Osteen. His father was part of this movement. So Joel Osteen would not exist if not for this movement. You go over to the Kansas City Fellowship, IHOP KC, International House of Prayer in Kansas City. This was
not the pancake place.
Not the pancakes.
House of Prayer with Mike Bickle, disgraced minister. Go on.
Right. So this was basically Branhamism 2.0, which we'll get into that a bit in this podcast probably as well, because at the church that Vance Bolter was attending, they were in close contact, apparently, according to the sermons that I've heard, with Mike Bickle and the International House of Prayer, and were even promoting some of his literature. So that's another interesting story.
Yeah, and if I may just interrupt for a second and say, when I talk with Jeff, his floor mate who saw his radicalization, he said he turned into a religious zombie and gave up baseball and everything. He said that his name was pronounced Belter, even though it's with an O. It's a silent O. So just thought I would bring in Jeff and thank him for he saw our video and was like, I knew this guy. I can't believe he murdered somebody.
Wow.
I saw him turn from a regular dude with good sense of humor, like girls, love baseball, to now he's a murderer. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to you.
Well, and
your story.
And to that point, while we're talking, I get all kinds of emails from all kinds of people, but some of them have some very positive feedback that I do pay attention to. One person said that we need to, whenever we mention the word radical, we need to go a little bit deeper with what that means. Because in today's world, when you're thinking of politics, you think of the radical Republicans or the radical Democrats, and it has a very, very different meaning than what you and I are talking about, which is a radicalized person. So maybe we could talk to that just a little bit.
Yeah, it's a personality disorder. Speaking as a mental health person, it's a dissociative disorder. And typically the family and friends go, he's a different person, like almost overnight. So he used to like poetry and girls, and the next minute he thinks girls are evil and he throws out his poetry, which is what happened to me in the Moonies. So this radical personality change doesn't erase who they were before, but it layers over it. And it's significant because the recent roommate of Belter said that he had gotten converted the year before he actually did get recruited into Christ for the Nations, this Branham thing. So we want facts and verifiable things going out.
Absolutely. And you know, to that point, whenever somebody gets radicalized and they lose connection with what they had in their past, that's kind of the opposite of my story, because I was born and raised in this thing. I was raised to be radical. And people have asked me, what was it like whenever you left this thing? And it's very difficult to explain, because I literally from birth was taught that if this dead guy he died in 1965, William Branham did, I was told that if he said that the sky was pink, that my eyes couldn't see the pink in the sky. So there must be something wrong with my eyes. That's the level of brainwashing that we went through. So people ask me, what was it like? And the best explanation that I can have is picture being born and raised in a North Korean camp where they have detained victims of some war, and then suddenly, after being in there for 50 years, they're transplanted into the United States. Nothing is familiar. That's what it
Yeah.
feels like when you leave.
Yeah, it's really important. And I realized, John, I wanted to plug your most recent book. In the intro, I forgot, so forgive me. The latest one, you've written many, including how Branham was involved with the Ku Klux Klan and all of these other criminal elements. But this book is called Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR. And NAR stands for New Apostolic Reformation, that I wrote about in The Cult of Trump being his biggest base. And it's written by you, John Andrew Collins. So your books are invaluable. We'll add that for those who are watching the video, they see all of your instruments in the background. You're a musician, a songwriter, a singer. You're also an IT specialist. You have a company that helps people with techie stuff. So this is like a hobby-esque, like Hobby Plus, because you've used your tech skills to create this incredible body of information about the history of this cult. You even helped to write a thing about Jim Jones for the survivor group, connecting the dots between Jim Jones and William Branham. So back to your story, sir, please.
Right. And so the music it's a big part of my story. And part of the reason I have this as my background for the podcast that we do, it's on YouTube channel, Leaving the Message, and it's called the William Branham Historical Research Podcast on Spotify and Apple. But I was literally everything within the realm of doctrine and scripture that William Branham said, even if it was just his opinion, people took it as doctrinal truth, and you must adhere to every rule that was his wild, harebrained opinion. I'm told that my family were musicians. My grandfather played the guitar. Aunts and uncles, they all had like a traveling ministry where they played music and sang and preached. And William Branham told them that stringed instruments were of the devil. So I was raised with this weird conundrum, because on my mother's side of the family, they all loved stringed instruments. We played guitars, etc. On the father's side, they thought this was the closest thing to hell that you could get to. And my parents would battle it out. And so it was always a conflict, and I was always strongly condemned for it. So after I got out of this, the drums especially, so I've got drums over here behind me. The drums especially were the devil's instrument, man. So I have it in every video, so I can show you that the devil has not attacked me while I sit in this room.
Yeah, and honestly, I think, creativity, music, singing, songwriting is an expression of God's creativity and what makes humans so special. So, but it's so fascinating for me to note that, like so many people who come out of a controlled environment, part of the healing is like raising a middle finger and going, the hell with that. I like music. I'm going to play till my heart's content.
Absolutely.
And for those watching you, your face is really red now. It's very funny. We struck a chord to make a joke.
Yeah. It's a deep-rooted chord too. I mean, I can't explain to you how this was like growing up, wanting to play instruments. And I'll never forget when my grandfather brought me my first guitar. I think I was 12 years old, and my father had him send it back to Georgia, where it came from. Later, I got it, and I guess my mom talked him into it. I don't know how that happened, but the very day that I got it, that night at 3 a.m., I was actually playing it. I play by ear. So I learned very quickly, and all I do, you've probably seen them. I do these documentary videos and whatnot. My podcast, I do all the background music in that. And like you say, it is very much a middle finger, because
I love it. I love it. I love ex-members who are successful, who are creative, who use their talents and abilities. And But let's circle back, because I want to be clear for my listeners to understand. William Branham was one of the very first people to claim to speak to God and be a prophet, and say Armageddon's coming and do faith healings and this early stuff that and I interviewed Elle Hardy, who wrote a book on Pentecostalism, and she made the point, this is a new invention. This was in the 1900s. This was not 2,000 years ago that people were Pentecostal and doing this stuff. So back to you. So there are all these tapes of this guy who claimed to get divine messages, and people to this day are like treating them as if they're divine scripture. Right?
Absolutely.
Taking it literally.
And there's another history too. I have another book called A Critical Examination of John Alexander Dowie. And in that book, Dowie was actually the prototype for most of this mess that we see. But John Alexander Dowie was a con man who stole a church in Australia. And it's a long, funny story. You can read the book and find out about it. But he comes to the United States in the late 1800s at a time when the United States does not use any critical thought with religion whatsoever. So he comes into the town and says that he heals all these people, and the newspapers actually printed that he healed all these people. So people were flocking from all over, and he grew into this big name. Long story short, he migrated to Chicago, Illinois, and then into what is now Zion City, Illinois, and created this massive cult compound. He made, in 10 years' time, he made $10 million, which in today's money is like $500 million.
Whoa.
So that's very important to the story that we're talking about here, because from his cult commune, there were key figures who wanted to take over his empire, not just his religious empire, but his financial empire. One of those was Charles Fox Parham, the founder of modern Pentecostalism. They came and he started this deliverance cult, and they were actually killing people in the commune, trying to heal them and forcing their bones to be straight when they're crooked, and literally killed this woman by snapping several of her bones.
Whoa.
With him was John G. Lake, who's also widely respected in this movement, F.F. Bosworth, who mentored William Branham. But in that sect was also a man by the name of Gordon Lindsay. He was born in Zion City. He later became William Branham's campaign manager, and he founded Christ for the Nations. So from this one cult was the epicenter. And while Branham was touring, and he's doing the thing, you're exactly right, he was claiming divine revelation and whatnot. They record all his sermons. Well, Dowie also recorded his sermons. So he's learning and he's being mentored by Bosworth, and they're trying to establish a second Zion City, but make it international instead of just in Illinois.
Yeah, fascinating. So I know that we talked years ago with the Mackenzie, the Kenyan minister who told people not to drink or feed their children, and all these people died. That was a splinter group of the message too, wasn't it?
I don't know if it was a splinter group, but it was directly or indirectly influenced by it. Actually, I could say directly. So we're talking about, his name was Paul Mackenzie, and I think it's referred to as the Shakahola Forest Incident or Massacre. The investigators picture this place where everybody is going for their death. They're going here, and he's telling the people that the world is ending. We need to escape faster, so we're going to starve ourselves and die. He, of course, did not starve himself, the leader, Paul Mackenzie, but he was making the people do it. Well, they migrate into the forest, bringing with them only the things that were most prized to them before they die. Among those prized possessions were several books that were printed not far from here. The headquarters is called Voice of God Recordings in Jeffersonville, Indiana. And I have, in fact, in the other room, you can't see it, but behind me, I have many of those books that they took into the forest with them. They're William Branham sermons.
Yeah. So there's a direct link, in other words, to that group.
Right.
But so circle back to the Ku Klux Klan, the criminal history, the harms, and some of their beliefs. I mean, I know that they're homophobic and xenophobic, and men are the head of the household, and anti-music. You mentioned some of that, but give us a little more flavor of what this group's about.
Basically, I've been trying to figure out how to explain this to a person who wasn't in it, but the easiest way to explain is if you have a man who's mentally insane screaming rants against this, that, and the other that annoys him, and people on the other side of the pulpit from him are listening to the rants and the insanity, and they're saying, oh, that's a spiritual doctrine. Now we have a new rule. That's literally what it was. Because it was a doomsday cult, and we believed that we would get what's called rapturing faith, if through listening to these recordings after he's dead, we believe that the rapturing faith would come from those recordings. So what happens is you don't have this rapture event, and the world has not ended. So what happened? He's dead. Well, we must have missed something. So people go back and they listen to these recordings, and they, with a fine-tooth comb, try to find little things that they're not doing correctly in order to establish this rapturing faith. And he ranted on my website. If you type in rules, you can see a list of these, but he ranted everything from wearing blue suede shoes to women using the washing machine. That's how wide.
We're evil.
Yes. I mean, and it's not like my family knew him growing up, so I know he had a washing machine. Many of the things he ranted about, he ranted against television, for instance. A wide swath of the cult are not allowed to watch the television. But my family grew up with him, and he had TVs. Even the children had TVs, I'm told. So he's literally just ranting because he's angry. But now that he's dead, people are trying to find this rapturing faith because somehow we missed it. He died.
Yeah, because he's perfect. He's doing God's will. He's God's messenger. I just want to compliment you. I think the North Korea analogy works. And I think what you just said about someone who's like delusional, ranting from the pulpit, and people are taking it as if there's deep spiritual knowledge coming from this person. And they're trying to blame themselves for not being open enough or spiritual enough to understand the message. And that's what was also happening when I studied QAnon. People were getting these crumb droplets, and everyone was going nuts trying, well, what is Q really trying to say here? And they're trying to make meaning and see patterns where there was no meaning. It was a psyop meant to confuse people and cause them to distrust the administration and follow them.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this weird connection too. I actually mentioned Q in the book that you held up. In my latest book, I'm talking about the Christian identity, how it came into the United States, how it morphed through the different various flavors of religion in the United States. And so I'll sum that up in a nutshell, because I think it's also important to understand the background to what created Belter, I should say.
Yeah.
So there was this belief that was a harebrained notion that the people of the British Isles were the direct descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And it was a very small cult-like group that developed this in the UK. Well, apparently somebody found out that there's some money in this, because people will come and they'll if you're the lost children of Israel, we should have a finance and we should create our own kingdom, etc. So people were starting, especially the wealthy, were getting into this. Well, it came into the United States, and it came into the United States at a time whenever there was beginning to be some seeds of racism forming. It wasn't there yet, but it started spreading throughout the United States, and it became a key component to what became modern Pentecostalism. But as you get closer into, I think it's the 20s and 30s, you're starting to see now racism is really spreading with the Ku Klux Klan. And you have, what's the book called? The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion was spreading throughout the United States. So you have the Jewish conspiracy theories.
The Russian conspiracy theory,
Yeah. So all of that merged into British Israelism, and that combination formed what is called Christian identity. I'm a Christian. I identify with this lost 10 tribes of Israel nonsense. And there's this whole slew of other weird things that people just can't imagine that's mixed with it. For example, they believed that the Great Pyramid of Giza was actually a time marker so that we could understand when the end of days would be. And the path leading down to the king's chamber, each bump in that path was a major significant milestone in world history. And they were saying we can predict the end of the world, we can predict the Great Depression, all of these things from the Great Pyramid of Giza. And they were touring.
Reminds me, isn't that connected to the Jehovah's Witnesses belief? They have something with the pyramids too, if I'm remembering correctly.
It's actually the reason why, because they were also subscribing to the same type of ideology. They believed this British Israel nonsense. But the moment at which it gets really, really problematic, this also ties back into Christ for the Nations. It's the book, what did I read? It was Michael Barkun's book, Religion and the Racist Right. He had all of the Christian identity research, but he didn't have all the latter-rain Branhamism. When you put the two together, I realized it fit like a glove, which is why I wrote this book that we're talking about. Whenever it began to spread, it spread largely through what was it called? The Dearborn Independent. Henry Ford was backing it. And Henry Ford, I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name, but the man who published it became a significant figure in the Anglo-Saxon Federation, which was publishing anti-Semitism, Christian identity, the racist forms of Christian identity. And over time, they integrated this notion that Eve mated with the serpent in the Garden of Eden, and that sexual union produced a bloodline that was subhuman. So we, who are the descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, we meaning them, not me, we're the good guys, and everybody who's of this evil bloodline is the bad guys. So you created this yin and yang type of nonsense.
The ham teachings.
The ham teachings.
The black people. The Moonies taught that, by the way. The Moonies taught that the serpent had intercourse with Eve, and Eve seduced Adam. And that's how the Garden of Eden fell away from God's plan, and why we need a Messiah to come back to have lots of sex with women to purify their wombs. And, then so Sun Myung Moon had all these mass wedding craps. I did want to give one piece of feedback, though, in what you just said about the racism piece, and just that in my research helping the First Nations Caring Society of Canada, what I learned with colonialization was that the Pope had basically said all those indigenous people are inferiors. If you can't make them good Christians, kill them. Steal their children and brainwash them, make them good little Christians. So there was some racism before, just black people, but it was aimed at stealing the land and the resources from the people who lived here before the Pilgrims came and all that.
Absolutely. And I probably should have clarified. Michael Barkun mentions this in the book a lot better than I probably can do in 5 minutes. But the British Israel doctrine itself did not have racism in the doctrine. It was mainly, it was more of a pride thing. We're prideful because we're the lost 10 tribes of Israel. When that came into the United States, the British Israel doctrine then mixed with the racism. That's how it produced Christian identity.
Yeah, and my work for 49 years of tracking cults, it's like the new cult. Oh, he's an ex-member of this cult who was in this cult before that. And you get, all of these terrible groups that were informed by Hubbard of Scientology or of Blavatsky or, or William Branham.
Yeah, and you probably get it too. I often get the accusation, well, this is guilt by association. You can't make all of these connections. But if you understand how this works, somebody gets this harebrained notion and gets a large group of people to believe this notion. Well, once they realize that notion is false, they've already been influenced. So whenever they go and add a new harebrained notion to the one that they've been influenced by, it develops into something entirely different. And the mistake that religious scholars often make, which is why they've not discovered that Branham was the roots of many of these things, is that they try to evaluate one sect or one group by its doctrine alone, and they don't really translate, because the doctrine may morph into something entirely different. For example, William Branham was strongly tied to Oneness Pentecostalism, which is the notion that the Trinity is evil. There is a modalistic view of God. God was always one person. He was always the Father, then he was the Son. Now today he's the Holy Spirit. Whereas Trinitarians believe that there are three in one, and openly teach
conservative Christianity teaches the Trinity.
Exactly. Well, Branham himself had no convictions. I'm convinced he was an atheist. That's my opinion. But he would go to one city and he would preach Oneness Pentecostalism and say that anybody who teaches the Trinity has taken the mark of the beast and they're doomed to hell. And then he would go to the very next city and he would preach the Trinitarian doctrine, and as though he's never preached against it, and even pray to the persons of the Spirit of the Trinity in his prayers. So you're left with this conundrum. Well, what does the guy actually believe? I'm told by people who were there that he actually baptized in the Trinitarian formula and also condemned anybody who's baptizing in the Trinitarian. But what happens is those people who are influenced by Branham in the Trinitarian version of Branham, well, now they produce another sect or a splinter group that is Trinitarian. Whenever a researcher who is looking only at doctrine looks at the two, they see them as two completely separate entities, as though they were never connected. However, because Branham preached everything under the sun, they can still be connected if you know where to look.
Yeah, so I want to just say that my research says that the stereotypical profile of cult leaders is malignant narcissism, which is not just the grandiosity, the entitlement, the need for constant praise, the transaction, but lack of empathy. And then when you get into the malignant thing, they think they're above the law, they're pathological liars, they're sadistic, paranoid, the whole list. And these folks, and I include Branham, even though I've never met the man, but when you describe him, it's like he's like sizing up his audience. So we're going to go to this city. He has his advanced scouts, figuring out how we're going to get the biggest number of people so that we can get the most money. And so then he preaches what is going to be received. And so, but in his head, it's like the ends justify the means, and maybe he's deluded and thinks that he's, God's greatest gift to mankind, because malignant narcissists often think they're the center of the universe anyway. And he loves the power that people will do whatever he says, and he can get a lot of money, get a lot of power, maybe get into some people's skirts or pants or whatever. Was there any sexual abuse that you were aware of from Branham?
Absolutely, but we've had people mention it, but nobody who's willing to openly testify. So nothing that I can document historically. However, there's this weird trail that followed him, and it was with the same sex, not with opposite sex. Many of the people who were in Branham's leadership circles were homosexual, and they later had many, many issues. And in fact, some of them turned out to be predators. What's really interesting I did not know this last time you and I spoke, but I pour through FBI documents once they're declassified. Anything that's in this realm, I try to catalog it.
You are an information vacuum, my friends.
Well,
I admire you so much.
So there's this weird history that it ties to all this, and I don't know yet what to make of it. It goes beyond. This is probably worthy of another podcast in of itself, but I'll give you the highlight because it does kind of tie to this. One of William Branham's campaign managers was the Baron William T. Frary von Blomberg. This man,
what a name!
It's a crazy name, and it's a crazier story. If you look it up, you won't believe it when you see it. This man from Boston gets adopted by a baron in Germany, and essentially takes him on, and he became the adopted. Was it the cousin? Somewhere he's related to Werner von Blomberg, which was Hitler's Minister of Defense. And he had counsel with Hitler. He toured Dachau. He comes back to the United States and said, Hitler's a great guy. This is back before the war.
Right.
Well, he goes on to found many religious organizations, and he worked on the board of others which were significant. One of them is the Fellowship Foundation. He was a director for the fellowship, the family. He was on the board of directors for the Bob Jones University. He was Branham's campaign manager, and he was, to those who knew him, was openly homosexual. So declassified FBI documents now examine him, and when you read through it, it's kind of funny because one of the reasons why they're following him around trying to figure out what is this German guy doing, who is an American, is because he's openly homosexual. He's having homosexual flings in his hotel rooms on these campaign tours, and he does not fit the profile of the people that he is managing. So what is this? And one thing, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but he and Branham and others went to other countries and established similar organizations like the Fellowship Foundation in other countries. So if it is espionage, it's the perfect means to do it. But he set all of this up. But the long story short is that the FBI were trying to track him because this doesn't make any sense. This guy's gay, and you can't be gay in this movement. They condemn you strongly. And then you come to find out other people who were in the movement were also homosexual and predators. So Baron Frary T. von Blomberg takes William Branham to Germany, where they meet the founder of the Colonia Dignidad, where there's all kinds of torture.
Oh, was that Central America or South America?
Well, it started in Germany. He was a Branhamite in Germany. His name was Paul Schaefer. Paul Schaefer goes to Chile and starts Colonia Dignidad, and he has this thing for young boys. And honestly, I can't tell you what all he did. I cover it some in the book, but it's so bad that you'll get filtered on the podcast if I tell you what he did to those boys.
Yeah.
And on that same tour, he's with Paul Kane, who later comes out as homosexual. And I'm told, I don't know if this is documented or not, but I'm told that it wasn't consensual. There were some issues with his homosexuality that was significant. And that's just a few of the names that I'm mentioning. There are others who had the same issue.
Yeah, so let me state, my listeners know that I'm pro-gay rights. My son is gay. We're pro-human rights. We're talking now from the angle that they're preaching the celibacy, purity, we're doing God's holy work, and in fact, they're doing grave harm. And you mentioned at the beginning the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. Michael Bickle also has been alleged to be a predator of women and such. And the fellowship, wasn't that, am I remembering correctly, Jeffrey Charlotte's book on the family talked about the fellowship? That's part of the same group that does the National Prayer Breakfast.
Yes.
Didn't you say that here's a picture of Branham at one of these things? Because Moon was at one of these prayer breakfasts too, I believe.
It is, but there needs to be a clarification because at the time, I did not realize there are two prayer breakfasts. There was the one that was hosted by the Fellowship Foundation, and then there was another one with the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship International. That is the one that Branham was at, and that is the one that was started by the Kardashian family.
Interesting. The famous Kardashian family?
The famous.
Interesting. So you got to say some things about the Ku Klux Klan. We can't get through this interview without your book on the Ku Klux Klan, please.
It's such a crazy history. I didn't believe it whenever I first came in contact with it, the information, but somebody contacted me and they slipped me a piece of information it was a Senate hearing. I can't remember the name of it, but after the Kennedy assassination, the feds just totally investigated the Klan and everything white supremacy. And William Branham's mentor was named Roy E. Davis. And there's a Roy E. Davis that was testifying about what happened with the Klan. And so he sent this to me, and I couldn't believe it. I started looking, and I thought, nah, it can't be the same guy. But I went down this rabbit trail of trying to find out who this man is. And good Lord, this was like a evil version of the Music Man. This guy is everywhere, swindling every town, he would get on the railroad tracks and he would go to one town and plant a church and preach at it as if it's his place of living. And then he would say, I'm going to go on a missionary trip. Can you fund me? Well, he would go plant another church and he would have multiple churches with multiple wives and multiple lives. And this was going on from Texas through Louisiana, all the way to Georgia, all the way to South Carolina. And in this one weird instance, this woman is in the middle of nowhere in Texas, and he's holding a revival, and she sees him and says, wait a minute, that's not who he says he is. He's our preacher back in Akron, Georgia, or someplace in Georgia, and exposes the whole thing. And back then, the Texas Rangers got involved because this man is bigamy. This man's doing evil in our eyes, right? Well, that's how this man got started. He was a criminal. He was a bigamist. He had an affinity for I'm told underage girls is what the newspaper says, but I'm told that's wrong. I need to say women who are in their teens. He takes them across state lines for the purposes of sex, which is a violation of the Mann Act. And he does this from state to state to state. Well, he's running from this exact problem when he comes to my hometown of Jeffersonville, Indiana, and planted my grandfather's church. And so, like you said, I'm going through these newspaper articles. I'm in the library with these little microfiche. I didn't even know how to use a microfiche. I'm learning how to do it. And back then, they've got better equipment now, but back then it was really difficult because you could read it, but you couldn't do anything with it. So I would take a picture of it with my phone, and I would take it home and I would digitize it. I did this for hours and hours and hours, and found out that he planted my grandfather's church. He mentored Branham, and there was this whole history that the cult had concealed from us, where Branham is working with not just Roy E. Davis, who was the second in command of the 1915 KKK. Roy Davis helped write the bylaws, etc. Davis was working with Caleb Ridley, who was the Klan's supreme religious chaplain, and they were trying to establish, it was a short-lived organization called the Supreme Kingdom, but they were trying to establish what today you could almost say it was the prototype for today's Dominionism. They were trying to invade the government, the education system, the entertainment industry. That's what they were doing. The organization died out because Caleb Ridley was a scoundrel and he got all kinds of trouble. Davis, however, did not. He rose up to be the next imperial wizard of the Klan, and he is the key figure in the Klan in Dallas during the time of the Kennedy assassination. So this trail, it's a wide history that I uncovered this. all along the way, I'm looking at the timeline of sermons because I've got all of these recordings of William Branham, and I'm starting to see he is promoting Branham even after Davis has been exposed as being with the Klan. So then I have to go to all the locations where Branham is holding his revivals, and I'm starting to notice, wait a minute, that's an area where Davis is deeply embedded, and Davis is holding these big drives, such as Shreveport, Louisiana, which was a big epicenter for the message cult. Shreveport was a stronghold for Roy Davis. So I started piecing all of these together and putting together a timeline, which I've discussed with you, and it turned into more information than I knew what to do with. So I've written a few books on it.
Yeah, no, you could teach a college course on the history for sure. You just check out this website. It's William Branham Historical Research website. But let's circle back to Belter and the assassination, and my concern, and I think yours too, that people who think they're doing God's will, that they're going to fight the devil, can have these personal revelations / delusions and do horrible acts of violence.
Absolutely. And people, they don't really understand it. Whenever you're on the outside of this looking in, you see that this is a religion and it's got doctrine that you disagree with. That's how the average casual person looks at this.
Right.
But it isn't just that. There is a rewiring of the brain that happens when you're in these groups and they're radicalizing you so that you may be casually going about your day-to-day business, but you hear something that triggers you. And when that trigger happens, you really can't understand what goes on in the person's head. I always go back to the example of the suicide bombers who, whenever they interview the people who lived around him, he was the nicest guy. I knew him. I can't believe he did this. Well, he got triggered. Something snapped in him, and he goes and he does this thing. Well, I can't say, we don't yet know all the details behind Belter and why he did what he did. But we do know, based off of the research that we have, and some of this I just got right before this phone call. I started going through, I'm not going to mention the name of his church because I don't yet want to bring them into the spotlight. But I found the church where Belter was affiliated with, and I found out that he actually was an elder of sorts in the church. And so I started looking through all the sermons and listening to them, and I have identified that this church was in fact associated with Mike Bickle's International House of Prayer in Kansas City. There's one sermon where a man mentions Mike Bickle, and he mentions him casually as though the audience knows who he is. So that tells me that they're in association of some sort.
Right. Also,
the minister graduated from, there's these weird universities that aren't quite accredited that, I don't know if this is one or not, but I could not find any legitimate accreditation for the university that he got his doctorate from. But what I could find was a leader of an organization called Youth with a Mission, which I'm told by many of its followers that it also is a cult that bears a striking resemblance.
I've heard that as well from former members.
Whether they are or whether they aren't, they are also strongly affiliated with the International House of Prayer. I'm working with, on the podcast, we actually talk through, they call it YWAM, Youth with a Mission. Members who were in Bickle's organization were also members of YWAM. Well, Lauren Cunningham, who founded that organization, was the primary endorsement for the university. So there's multiple trails leading back. So I continued listening, and I started listening, trying to identify anything that was related to Branhamism or to Christian identity.
Yeah.
And what I found, it was a little bit odd. I never found an instance of them mentioning Branham's name, but they always referred to the movement as the message. And whenever they preached, they would refer to their sermon as this message. And so this was common to me growing up.
That's DNA of Branhamism.
DNA of Branham. I mean, it's cut and dry. The thing that really pushed me over the edge, however, in Branhamism, and this was developed because of Christian identity. If you go back to what we said earlier about the lost 10 tribes of Israel, the way that they interpret these doctrines, if you are the descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, then you are obviously to believe that passages in the Old Testament that was written to Israel are instead written to you instead of the people that they were actually written for. So an example of this, Branham said that the old prophet Nahum was describing Outer Drive in Chicago, where I'm holding this meeting, because he could take that passage, rip it out of its context. Through British Israelism, this makes sense. To the rest of the world, it's nonsense. One of the passages that they ripped out of context was the last chapter of the book of Malachi. There's a passage in Malachi 4 that says, before the great, and in today's language, it's translated great and awesome, but in the old King James English, it's before the great and terrible day of the Lord, I will send you Elijah the prophet, and he will bring the hearts of the fathers to the sons and the sons to the fathers. Almost every mainstream Christian that I'm aware of refers to this as John the Baptist, because there's a passage from Luke that is tying it to John the Baptist. In Christian identity, you are instead to believe that the Elijah figure is one coming, not one in the past. William Branham's group believes that William Branham was this Elijah. This group, this church that Belter came from, they are teaching the future Elijah doctrine, which is also key Branhamism. And assuming that they got their information from IHOP KC, which I don't know other than I see them mentioning Mike Bickle and some of Mike Bickle's literature. This was something that Paul Kane, who was William Branham's protege, taught IHOP KC. So through that transference, you can see where they likely got this. But we have Belter at a church as a missionary to other countries who is affiliated with Mike Bickle and promoting Mike Bickle's literature, who's teaching the message and calling the movement the message, and who is teaching that this Elijah figure is coming just like they did in IHOP KC. So it ties it all the way through my research from here, all the way back to Davis, all the way back to the Klan, all the way back to the kingdom theology that was emerging in Great Britain.
So I know we both saw some footage of Belter in the Congo, jumping around on stage, but I guess I want to just try to connect some dots. We know the Klan was violent. We know they would harm people, track them down, lynch them, firebomb them, and such. Let's talk about what could be in Belter's head that he would have a list of people to assassinate. Like, I'm not thinking he was, told by Russia to go and kill Democrats, but with this whole mindset, this black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil, we're doing God's will, these are the last days. Talk a little bit more about how someone could be radicalized to become an assassin.
It's interesting in a church setting, because in a church setting, you're not legally permitted to go after politicians. There's a sedition law that you can't just openly tell your church vote for one person or don't vote for another.
That used to be the case, but it got written out of law, is my understanding, during the first Trump administration.
I think he fought it. Maybe you're right. Maybe it did get overturned. But anyway, in the time period we're talking about, in the past, the way that they got around this was a methodology that they still use. If it did get overturned, they still use it today. Instead of talking about the politician, what they will do is they will brand a politician or a policy. They'll brand it with one of these figures from the Old Testament that's usually a villain. So in Branham's day, he labeled JFK as Ahab, and he labeled Jacqueline Kennedy as Jezebel. And so all of the listeners who were programmed with that, is loaded language. They were loaded language to refer to those people as those two. Well, then every sermon thereafter where he's talking about them, he would say things like, we need somebody today who will stand up and rise up against Ahab, or we need to storm Ahab's door. Well, if you're listening to it and you don't understand this loaded language, you don't realize that those are very militant terms, and they're to people who might just be crazy enough to go do it. I have just started analyzing the sermons, like I said, today, so I don't know if they're using those types of language in these sermons, but I can tell you that it developed from groups that did. I do know that, so you mentioned Christ for the Nations. Gordon Lindsay spoke at key conferences with the Christian identity people, including the Anglo-Saxon Federation. So these are very militant organizations in the past. Now, in the later years, Christ for the Nations became kind of indifferent. I wouldn't call them militant today, but it is in its past. And if you get so indoctrinated that you want to identify with the group, and you start reading the literature, you're bound to come across some of the literature that is very militant.
Yeah, you're talking about something. I think the term is stochastic violence. It calling to violence, but not saying go kill X, Y, or Z, but just creating that mindset that it's justified and necessary. But I have to say, I am very aware of messaging that literally, especially QAnon plus, QAnon first came on the market in 2017 as an entity, but they would literally say that Hillary Clinton was a pedophile in the basement of Comet Pizza with trafficking girls, and that they're demons. And so, do you want to kill demons? Because she's a demon. So this kind of mindset, especially when you have the framing of we're in the last days of judgment and I'm part of the elect that is doing God's will on earth, you could see how somebody could then take that step over the line. And of course, for myself as a mental health professional, I'm trying to shed a spotlight on this is dangerous mind control stuff. That we never want to demonize other human beings to the point where they're subhuman so we can do terrible things to them. Unfortunately, this administration that we are living under is doing that very same thing at the moment. And it's really causing an atmosphere of great fear and trepidation and insecurity and uncertainty. And I'm hoping more legit Christians who study the Bible and know Jesus' teaching and Sermon on the Mount and 1 Corinthians 13 about love can speak out against this militarization of the Christian identity, Christian dominionism, New Apostolic Reformation. I just want to thank you for being you. Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR by John Andrew Collins. This is your latest book. How many other books have you done? Is it 5 now?
I've actually unpublished more than I've published. I want to say the numbers in like 30 or something like this. But the problem was, and not to go off into too long of a tangent, but the problem was because they've concealed so much of their history, as I get facts and I wrote about them, I would get more facts and the picture would get not really incorrect, but much bigger. And so I would take that book down. But I think you're right. I think the ones that are published is like 5 books.
Well, it's called updated editions. You can I learned more. I can do, and especially if you're the publisher, you don't have to negotiate a contract and such. Coming back to Belter and this horrible crime and the times that we're living in, we want to de-escalate violence and talk about how people like yourself can be born into one of these, really destructive authoritarian groups, leave it, get married, have 3 boys, play music, play drums, have a great life and help people. And final words are yours, my friend.
My final words would be to agree with that. We need to get rid of the militant language. I grew up with it, and all it does is turn people to hate other people. And as humans, we're not wired this way. If you look at school children, they want to love each other because that's human nature. But we have this thing in the name of religion, which I'm hesitant to even use the term Christianity because that's not what this is. But this thing has developed in our nation that is now strongly tied to politics that says we should hate our neighbor, and that's not what Jesus said. So my advice is critically think about everything that they're saying. Even if you're in a healthy church, it doesn't hurt to critically think because it may not always be healthy. So critically think, read the Bible. If you're a Christian, understand what Jesus meant when he said to love your neighbor as yourself. That's the motto that I live by.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you so much, John. We'll be in touch, and all I can say is I want to empower more former members to share their stories if they're ready to, because I want to destigmatize the notion in the public that there has to be something wrong with you if you ever were in one of these belief systems, and remind people leave, they grow, they change, they get new information. And I keep meeting people who say, I was raised in this extremist family, and we trace it back, and it goes back to Branham. It's like,
it's the Spider-Verse.
John, it's another one. Yeah. But study Branhamism and learn the history of this. It's very fascinating. And let's be in touch soon, John. Thanks for your good work.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.